games industry in Australia has suffered severely in the past decade, with developers being forced to downsize or even close completely. However, compared to the developer problems in larger markets such as the UK or North America, these closures have sadly gone under the radar. The only one that really received much press was the closure of Team Bondi, which shut down almost immediately after the release of its oft-delayed magnum opus, LA Noire. In this episode, I want to pay tribute to Melbourne House, who I consider to be one of the most important developers in Australian gaming history. Sadly, they were a victim of the struggling Australian games industry. However, Melbourne House spent almost 30 years developing fantastic games. Strangely enough, Melbourne House originally had nothing to do with video games, having originally been founded in 1978 by Naomi Besson and Alfred Milgram in the UK to publish books. It was not until 1980, when they returned to Australia, that they decided to invest in the gaming market.
Yes, how are you, Bruce? Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce a chap from Pommyland who'll be joining us this year here in the philosophy department at the University of Wollongong.
They opened up a development studio in Melbourne, Beam Software, with the intention of publishing the games made by Beam under the Melbourne House label. The markets were dominated by the home computers of the time, with the company's early focus lying squarely on the Spectrum. Their first games, Hungry Horace and Horace Go Skiing, were released in 1982 and were actually packaged with the Spectrum hardware. However, it was their other major release from that year that set them on the way to the big time. In a stroke of genius, Beam Software had managed to acquire the rights to make a video game adaptation of The Hobbit. The company's history with book publishing helped them secure the deal, using the sweetener of promising to publish copies of the book alongside the game. The negotiations were completed in 1981, with the game being released a year later in 1982 to rave reviews and fantastic sales. The game actually managed to top the charts in Europe, an impressive feat for a title for anyone, let alone a brand new development studio. Aside from the popular license, the game found success through the technical innovations it brought to the text adventure genre. In the past, players had been limited to simple commands only, such as Go North or Attack Target. The Hobbit was programmed with a substantially more powerful string parser that allowed players to use adverbs and string together several actions into a single command. So instead of simply telling the game to attack target, players would instruct the game to pick up the short sword and carefully attack the target. This technical wizardry stimulated a major step forward for the genre, in a similar way to how Deathmatch influenced the first-person shooter. As a result, sales of The Hobbit skyrocketed, and the game was ported to the other major platforms of the era, such as the Commodore 64 and the BBC Micro. The next few years were kind to Beam Software. They created a popular graphic toolkit called Melbourne Draw. They developed the first fighting game for the home computer, The Way of the Exploding Fist. They released sequels to The Hobbit based on the Lord of the Rings novels. Most importantly, however, in 1987 they attained a license from Nintendo to begin developing for the newly released NES. One interesting fact that shows the technical prowess of the team was that they were already very knowledgeable about the Nintendo hardware well before making their application to Nintendo to develop for it. Beam had actually begun reverse engineering the Famicom hardware in 1985, a full year before it was even released outside of Japan, and 2 years before their development license was granted by Nintendo. They were so proficient with the machine that they created their own development tools, which Nintendo asked them to shelve in return for a license. This level of technical recognition was unusual for any company, let alone a small developer from Australia. In fact, Beam was only the second company outside of Japan to be granted a development license for the system. In the same year, 1987, the Melbourne House Publishing Company was sold to the Mastertronic Group. At this point, Beam Software and Melbourne House were still technically separate companies. This was the beginning of a major shake-up in the operations at Beam Software, with Melbourne House being sold by Mastertronic the following year to Virgin, who ceased distributing Beam Software's titles under the Melbourne House brand. This did not stop the development cycle, however, with popular titles continually being released through different publishers, all throughout the 90s. This included Star Wars for the NES, Super Smash TV for the Super Nintendo, and Crush, Kill and Destroy for the PC. The developer won several awards in the same period of time, including the Australian Multimedia Export Award. In addition, Beam themselves re-registered the Melbourne House name in 1996. At this point in time, Beam had grown significantly and had new, separate divisions working on other forms of multimedia, such as educational software and an online community at hotgames.com. This all led to a turning point in 1999, when the gaming division of Beam was sold to Infogrames. The leftover divisions renamed themselves to Blaze Limited and turned their attention to other areas, such as the telecommunications industry. This meant that Infogrames took control of the Beam software development team and the Melbourne House brand. Confusingly, Infogrames decided to collapse the two names and rebrand the development house as Infogrames Melbourne House. The renamed studio was becoming well known by a new generation of gamers, thanks to their innovative, highly detailed driving games. From GP500 for the PC, to Le Mans 24 Hours for the Dreamcast, to Grand Prix Challenge for the PlayStation 2. These games were wildly ambitious, technically impressive titles that helped advance the driving genre in the same fashion as The Hobbit moved the text-based adventure genre forward in the developer's early years. In 2003, Infogrames adopted the famous Atari name, and Melbourne House was again renamed in turn, this time to Atari Melbourne House. Their first, and only, game under this revised name was one of their most ambitious titles yet, Transformers Armada for the PlayStation 2. Instead of settling for a cheap licensed cash-in, the developers at Melbourne House rolled up their sleeves, got to work, and produced what remains as one of the most technically impressive titles on the PlayStation 2. Transformers was an action game that featured multiple playable characters and the ability for each of these characters to transform in-game at any time, allowing the players to seamlessly shift playstyles at will without any hit to the game's performance. It allowed for some clever level design and a wonderful sense of freedom unlike many other action games of the era. It also pushed a huge amount of action on the screen with very few technical hitches. One particularly memorable boss battle stretched across the whole level, not unlike some of the impressive bosses from the God of War series a few years later. In short, Melbourne House created a wonderful game that would have been memorable even without the strong license. After the release of Transformers, the landscape shifted for developers and publishers worldwide. Games required higher and higher budgets, and some were having trouble adjusting to the new consoles and the experiences expected by gamers. Atari had decided to move away from in-house development and were actively shopping their internal studios, such as Melbourne House. Chrome Studios was a giant Australian company who, at one point, employed about 25% of the professional game development workforce in Australia. They purchased Melbourne House from Atari in 2006, who were subsequently renamed again to Chrome Studios Melbourne. Unfortunately, this was the end of Melbourne House as we know it, with the developers being involved in larger projects rather than acting as an independent development studio, as they had done in the past. Chrome Studios worked on some popular franchises in the years to come, such as Spyro and Star Wars, but they had seemingly expanded too quickly and fell apart in 2010, firing virtually all of their staff. Chrome exists now in a massively reduced form, developing small-scale mobile and Facebook games, a far cry from the massive company that promised Australian developers the world a decade earlier. The story of Melbourne House, it's a sad one. A promising, young, local company, obviously full of talent, but it became little more than a bargaining chip being passed between the dying major companies. Unfortunately, developers in the late 80s and the 90s, they didn't have much choice but to try and align themselves with a major publisher, if they wanted their games to make it overseas. Small developers these days have far more opportunities via the internet. We need to cultivate local talent and try to regain the industry that's seemingly fallen away from the country's grasp. Who knows? Maybe one day Melbourne House will be revived. Until then, we'll always have their legacy.